Hello, and welcome to the 781st meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club, and I'm happy that you were able to join us today. I would like to welcome students joining us virtually from Mercy University, Duquesne University, and the University of Pittsburgh, as well as members of the 2024 class of ECNY Fellows. As a reminder, we're currently accepting applications for this select group of next-gen business thought leaders for 25. And so if you know of someone you think would be a good fit to be a fellow, please go ahead and get the application off the website or reach out to our team. The Economic Club of New York is proud to stand as the nation's leading nonpartisan platform for discussions on socioeconomic and political matters. And over more than a century, actually, we've hosted over 1,000 preeminent guest speakers, and we continue with that standard of excellence up to and including today. So it is an honor to have with us Jack Devine, the founder and chairman of the Arkin Group, a strategic intelligence firm that helps global clients mitigate risks and maximize opportunities. Jack's here to offer us some insight into the geopolitical tensions simmering around the world, pressing national security threats, and the role all of us can play in the private sector to support those security efforts. Jack spent 32 years in the CIA, where he served as both acting director and associate director of the CIA's operations outside the United States. He also served as chief of the Latin American division, head of the CIA's Counter-Narcotics Center, and head of the CIA's Afghan Task Force. Jack's regularly asked to share his expertise on national and cable news and in publications like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. He's also written 2 books and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Today, he'll be in a conversation with club member and former ECNY board member, Bob Hormats. Bob has been a senior official in 5 different presidential administrations and spent 25 years at Goldman Sachs. Today, he's vice chair of Kissinger Associates. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record. We do have media joining us. We plan to end promptly at 2:45. So now, Jack, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of you.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and it's a pleasure to be with Jack. Jack and I served together in Washington during the Cold War, and Jack really brings a remarkable amount of breadth and depth to his understanding of the foreign policy environment in which we operate, but also what goes on behind the scenes, and particularly the intelligence services, which play now, as they played during the Cold War, a very important role in American foreign policy and understanding what's going on in the world. So I'd like to start out by asking Jack to draw on his period of service and the depth of his understanding of various cultures and societies in all parts of the world, to give us a sense of how intelligence and the collection and utilization of intelligence differs today from that of the intense Cold War period. Obviously, the geopolitics are different, technology is different, but I wonder if you could dig deep into your repertoire of stories and ideas, and particularly insights, to give us a sense of how intelligence differs today from the Cold War period, what we've learned and what the new challenges are.
Well, again, it's a pleasure, Bob, to be with you. These are huge questions, right? So these are the only 2 I will answer, we'll be able to answer in 45 minutes. But let me just take 2 aspects of it. One is the geopolitical. How's it different today, right? And everyone is going to say, well, they're Cold Warriors, so they're going to reminisce about the Cold War. But I and you both have gone through when there was a Cold War, when there wasn't a Cold War, and now whatever you want to call today, right? And no one wants to call it a Cold War, but there are so many similarities. At least let's look at the similarities. So in the Cold War that we know, and everyone in the audience knows, it was Russia, China, and their allies against the United States, its NATO and its allies, right? And today, and then you had communism, and this is like a key point. This is one of the fundamental differences. You had an ideology on the other side, a philosophical view of the world, principles around it, flawed as they may be and turned out to be disastrous. Only China holds on to them, and seriously, which we will get on to it. But today, what are we looking at? We're looking at an alliance between Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and their allies. And the allies part is really important. I mean, you're talking about through Africa, through Latin America, through Southeast Asia. The one difference in that mix is Iran, because that was a jewel we fought over in the Cold War. And that jewel now looks like it has been put in the crown of the Russians. So when we're looking at it, yes, there's this ideological divide, and now it's self-interest and commonality of anti-democratic states against those that are democratic and have a Western-oriented view. So I think the question for us, instead of looking at Ukraine and Russia fighting, instead of China, Taiwan, or Iran and the Middle East and Israel, or North Korea, I think we have to look at it as another alliance. And that's a more formidable thing. And I think we need a strategic focus around that and how we're going to deal with it. I don't get the sense that we have crystallized that sense of this mosaic of an adversary that is really not much different. The second part, which again, I'll do quickly, is I think and reminisce about the way I used to do operations. You make people late at night, you do surveillance and try and shake people. I remember the first time we actually brought video into a training exercise. Today, kids have phones that do video on them. How you collect intelligence, it is so radically different. AI, the internet. I mean, the Cold War did not function from this. And actually, when I was in charge of counter-narcotics, I got the first insight into the new world. So I would say when you look at intelligence today, as much as I love the Le Carré books and movies, the difference isn't the enemy and the type of challenge. It's really how we do business. And technology has been a radical difference. Let me stop there because we could break that down into 100 pieces.
I'd like to probe you a little bit more on Russia, but since you mentioned Iran, let me just segue off of that. From my experience in the Middle East, which is certainly not as extensive as yours, but my experience is that very frequently what is not said, what is not made public is a lot more important than what is said and what is made public, and particularly in the Middle East. And I'm curious as to what you think is going on behind the scenes, because there's a lot of buzzing going on, but people at this point are very loath to be particularly public about it, which leads me to conclude that there is something that we don't know, or that is at least in the works. So I wonder if you could give us a sense of what you see going on there and what we're moving.
So let me dissect it in 3 parts. The last one's 2. Now, by the time we get done, I'm going to dissect it into 8 parts, right? But on Iran, I was chief of Iranian operations in 1985. The Iran-Contra affair. You want to spend an hour, 5 days, we could talk about Iran-Contra. But what was interesting is, what was Iran like in 85? It was sort of isolated, stuck in the middle between Russia and the United States and fighting a war against Iraq. 1 million people lost their lives in those battles. And we were siding with Iraq in that struggle. Today, when you look at the Middle East and you look at Iran's penetration of the Middle East since then, you could go to Lebanon, Gaza, the Houthis, Syria, Iraq. In other words, they have surrounded, in many ways, Israel. And they all have a common objective. And it's just two points to it. The destruction of Israel and the removal of the United States from the playing field. I mean, that's it. once you get that piece, then I think you understand where we are. They're much more dangerous, except what happened, and I don't want to get sidetracked here, but you know, they're much more powerful politically, organizationally, but they still haven't developed the battlefield muscle. Okay. So, but if you look at it, their penetration and their alliance with Russia, real alliance, oil, drones, business, voting together, is something that is really noteworthy. Your point about some of the most important things in diplomacy are never in the public or are not in the public. And having been in the spy business, I would say intelligence business. Spy business is a little too fancy. We never use that word, but intelligence business. It is true that many things need to be done in private, right? But the one thing I learned as a young person, I was in Chile when Allende was overthrown. If you're in the CIA and you write something, you're in a private discussion, there's action involved. You better be prepared to read about it. So there's a difference between, you don't know about it today, but all those engaged in secret negotiations and all need to think with a historical vision, because they're going to read that. So if you're saying today, what's going on in the negotiations and where we are, I would sum it up in this way. I think we're in an environment, well, let me put it, my network, my sources, my field experience would tell me that Iran wants a ceasefire, the Hezbollah wants a ceasefire, the Hamas wants a ceasefire for a very good reason. They've had their clock cleaned, as they say parochially. They've got to find a way to regroup. So the Israelis haven't pushed them out to the sea, but they are in a place where they need the ceasefire. Israel, on the other side, they have to be very careful they don't get hubris, because they have really done damage to Hezbollah, their leadership, and have shown Iran to be largely feckless, right, in dealing with. But they have to be careful that they don't set such high ambitions that the escalation gets out of hand in unpredictable ways. So you have a lot of people saying, now's the moment. Israel should push all the way and take out the nuclear facilities. I think there's more nuance than that. This is a way of saying, I think Israel is also, Netanyahu, this is not a bad time to have a ceasefire and catch your breath. But because of what I said earlier, it's not a permanent ceasefire. The underlying problems are not going away. So I think the conditions are good. Here's the political question, which I must turn back to you as a political authority. Do you do it in the lame duck session or the week after, right? And while there's a lot of pressure to try and get it done now, this is a political decision. What I'm telling you from an intelligence point of view, everybody seems to be ready now. There's some really hard negotiations that need to be done. Israel's not signing anything until they're comfortable that northern territory of Israel is safe to reoccupy. Until that's done, there won't be a ceasefire. But allowing that's agreed to and then taken seriously, right now I think it's a political decision on how do you time it. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that easy.
Well, you made an interesting point. I mean, the timing is important, but even before that, the difference, as you pointed out, in the Cold War was that the U.S. was in a relatively close relationship with Iran, and largely during the Cold War, our goal was in the Middle East to get the Russians out. That was part of our policy in Egypt. That was part of our policy in various areas of the region. Now it seems to me it's flipped on its head, and the goal of a number of these countries, led by Iran, is to push American influence out to the extent possible, although they have not been able to do that and probably are not able to do this. But the fact they had China as an intermediary on a negotiation between Iran and Saudi Arabia is something that we could only imagine could have happened 20 years ago, and now it actually did happen. But my guess is it's probably better to do this after the lame duck session, when you have a power in Washington that can actually make decisions and the U.S. will abide by them. Whereas if something is done in the helter-skelter environment of a transition, it may lack the sort of gravitas that you need to sustain the deal. That'd be my inclination. Although I would take any opportunity to do it. It just seems to me that one would be a better one, just in terms of the solidity of the outcome.
I think I agree with it's a very important point you made. There's a tug and pull. Is it politically smart to make points with the incoming or outgoing administration? But the second one, which is, it depends on statecraft, how sophisticated. Do you take an opportunity that may not be there tomorrow? I mean, so there is, this is a thoughtful moment. And
well, I would say if
I guess I'm leaning in the direction that the inclination will be to deal with it in the next administration. But
although I think we both agree that if you can get a deal now, it'll save lives now, and take it. Because sometimes things that look like they're on the table can be off the table. And if it's on the table, I would say take advantage of the moment. Although strategically, in a new administration, you have a more solid base for it here. That's all. But it's a tough call.
My hope, my expectation is that what they're doing, they don't have a position, right? It's like we're trying to, we want to make the conditions right. We're going to keep working, and they haven't made up their mind which side of that equation they want to be on. But people are losing lives. They have been at war. Do you save more now? So there is, I think, in fairness, the players understand each other better than sometimes we understand them. And I think they're wringing their hands on the political versus opportunity, but it has to look like a darn good opportunity, or they will take a pass. So I think you and I are pretty much in sync on this one. I say it's unknown until they played the hand a little bit further.
I think that's a very fair point. Let me flip back to Russia. I mean, Russia did something that we found very surprising, but in terms of Putin's mind and his goal for this greater Russia, the invasion of Ukraine was sort of part of that agenda. And I think he felt that perhaps the United States would not be full bore involved in supporting Ukraine. And he turned out to be right in terms of, certainly at the beginning of the process. So my question really relates to how the Russians are playing their game. I think we have a general idea of their goal for a greater Russia, the resurgence of Russia. If you can get territory, take it, which he's done. But I wonder if you could sort of dig deep into Putin's mind. I mean, he was a KGB guy. He knows the area well. He thinks he can push the U.S. Substantially and intimidate the U.S. with new weapons and rattling the nuclear saber. How do you judge Putin's objectives and what he wants out of Ukraine, and perhaps even more importantly, if he gets what he wants in Ukraine, what are his next moves? Because that won't be the end of it, probably.
So again, Bob, we're going to dice it into 4 parts.
All right.
But let's start. The second book I wrote, the first one was semi-autobiographical about the operations I was involved in, and I was in covert action, so I'm able to write with the without the objection of the CIA, because so much of it became public. And so I have views about when you use covert. The second book was about Russia and Ukraine and Russian operations and the way they work. And I have a chapter, it's called Spy Master's Prison. But I have a chapter in there that's called the Spy Master President, right? Spy Master, and you just referred to it. Former FSB head, former KGB as a young man, right? So where I ended up in the book when I was writing it is, Putin is not really a great strategic thinker. Right? The invasion of Ukraine was not a great strategic move. If we look and stand back, how that played out. Tactics is pretty good, but I would change the title of that chapter to the Mafia Don. In other words, I think if you're really trying to understand Putin, it's not as that sophisticated. You're trying to give it that sophisticated strategic look. He's a bare knuckle Mafia Don, right? And it's my territory. I'm getting it. We kill them. In other words, this is not you're going to sit down over tea and crumpets and work out some sort of relationship with them. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal right after the invasion in February 22. I believe the following week. I hope the newspaper people get this next part right because it causes me trouble. And I said the title was, he sowed the seeds of his own demise. Now, I should have said, I didn't mean yet tomorrow, right? It's that you're sowing the seeds. They have to maturate, right? So I'm saying the same thing. In a way, that was such a fundamentally flawed thing. He thought he was going to march in. They were going to celebrate. We thought he was going to march in. We had a 1945 mentality. Let me join the crowd and say, I thought he was going to be able to roll over, okay? But I did say in the book, he would underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainians when he did it. I should have said he will grossly underestimate, because we were going to get Zelensky out of there on a plane. So when you look at that act, that has changed the world in so many ways. That misstep has failed. Now, where are we today? We're at, I think, 1,006 days. If you told me Ukrainians and Russians would still be fighting about the border within this certain limit after 1,000 days, I would say, no way. And I think Putin and his generals would say, no way. But we'll get to this somewhere. War has been revolutionized, and we'll get to it. So this is Jack's unstudied, this is my opinion. And that is, I think Putin is trying to figure out how to get out of this thing. And in other words, I was basically saying, when you get a stalemate about where we are today and it's sustained, he will have trouble inside his own government, and we shouldn't play in that. So I think and where and how it happens, it's not an election, but governments fall when there's that kind of stalemate. So I think he probably recognizes it. My guess is he thinks he might be able to work out a deal with Trump. And whether it's a good deal, bad deal, it may be the same deal he would have worked out with Harris. He will be able to say, oh, I worked it out so he will have cover for action. Although Trump is a much better exploiter of the media, and I believe he will say, I worked out the big deal. But at home, it may provide an opportunity. So I'm giving you some optimism here, and that is, in the Middle East, I think we may be heading into it. I think in Russia, we may be heading into a stalemate than the one in the Middle East. So the question is, after he gets it, what does he do?
Right.
I think he's going to try and build a new army, right? I mean, the fact that he's got North Koreans, he's unloading the prisons. I mean, people have no idea of the depth of brutality of how many Russians are dying every day. I mean, by the hundreds every day. It is an amazing rate of loss. I mean, it's over. We want to start doing the numbers. We couldn't sustain it. We couldn't dream of sustaining those types of losses. So I think the moment's there, and I think it'll be a deal that neither party is totally satisfied with, but enough faces saved all around the table that life goes on. He doesn't get back into the G7. He doesn't become a national celebrity. He has spent all that goodwill. So he will be the head of a country with a GDP around the size of Spain's. And, again, I wouldn't bet on the durability of his regime into the distant future. But I want to be clear to the press. It's an exciting story. Jack says he's gone, but I'm not saying. I'm saying that conditions that begin it have recently started to set in with the stalemate. It's taken a long time to get to darn near stalemate.
As one follow-up question, what do we in the West need to do to prevent Putin from thinking to himself or to his government or country that I have, as a result of this war, taken back a portion of the territory which is deservedly ours in his mind? And then you have some smaller countries in the Baltics that could be very tempting to him if he thinks he can do anything there. What do we do in the West to demonstrate, both in terms of alliance activities, in terms of military capabilities, to strengthen the deterrence of other NATO allies so that the thought of duplicating this or replicating this does not enter into his mind, or that he sees the prospect of a loss to be far out to outgain the possibility of benefiting by seizing territory.
Yeah. I just recently started watching old fights, Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis. And what I'm about to say is I think he's been in a bare knuckle fight for the last 3 years. In other words, this isn't a fight where you wake up the next day and you feel refreshed and ready to go at it again. I think he's got a lot of healing to do. His economy has to be reset. God forbid he tried to take on the Poles. I mean, I think, once is enough. We have to realize he doesn't run the Communist Party. He's got a lot of friends, but they're my uncle used to call fair weather friends. You start another adventure and it doesn't work out. So yes, we should be mindful that he might try, but he just tried on the biggest piece you could win. And now you're going to go, try and pick up one of the small neighbors and somehow, what's that do? You're running a big risk, huge, huge risk. So I think he goes and licks his wounds and tries to, again, make the strongest army he can. But in the new environment, I mean, his army, when you saw that chain of trucks going from down that highway, 50 of them, 100 of them, you knew he didn't have any idea of the war he was getting into. Because if you looked at what drones do to those trucks, it just wipes them all out and everybody in them. So, I think coming back to it, he will have his own issues internally. So the Baltics should get strong, but what is Ukraine going to do? They're going to be rebuilding. We're going to be rebuilding. Let's get to the fundamental deterrence. Russia has a lot of nuclear weapons and ability to deliver them. And so do we, right? So there is the old Cold War deterrent. And now you've tried the Cold War action program. You try and move Afghanistan to our side, which I was part of. And, but there's limitations to it. You just gave it a big try and you failed. I think he tries to recover. I know he likes to wave and, his tactical weapons. I mean, as if you could fire a tactical weapon and everyone said, well, that wasn't a nuclear weapon. That's okay. So my point is, we need to be alert. We need to be in tip-top shape for all types of challenges around the world. But am I saying to you right this minute, look, we got to really get up speed for Russia? No, I think we're going to have to concentrate on Asia. But we were right to support the Ukrainians, the fullest, right? Maybe faster and more than we could have, but was substantial to keep them in the game, and they couldn't have stayed in without us.
You mentioned Asia, which is perfect because I wanted to segue to that, because from our point of view, there is clearly one power that we didn't have to deal with during the first Cold War, and now it's advancing its influence politically, economically, and strategically in the region. And the flashpoint could be Taiwan. We don't know what Xi's objectives are, although there are a lot of people who do speculate on this and what his long-term goal is with respect to Taiwan in terms of going back to the greater China that he talks about. So my question would be, what, from your point of view and from analyzing the intelligence, the Chinese objective realistically is, and what the United States should do to anticipate what the Chinese might do, or to deter them from doing what they might do.
One of the things I used to do in the intelligence community, they used to have, and it may still exist, the foreign broadcasting service, where we would pick up speeches of foreign leaders and it'd be translated, you could read them. And what I found instructive is we have great analysis, great reporting, but you better read what they're saying, right? Because sometimes they're telling you what they really want you to know and what they're telling their people. So what has she been saying? I want to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027, okay? We should not dust that away.
Right.
I think he wants Taiwan. It's part of his vision. And, you know, people get confused. It's not she like a person, some guy that just suddenly got elected in a presidential election. He's the product of the Communist Party. And again, when we mention communists, it sounds like, oh, what a throwback. But it's reality. He's part of a program and a system. And that system is deadly serious about this. So that's the scary part. But the second part is we're not the only ones looking at the fights in Israel and Ukraine and realizing that war is going to be fought differently. That next kinetic battle is going to look more like Ukraine than Stalingrad in 1945. So the question will be, how modern does Taiwan get in war fighting, and how much support we lend it between now and 2027? And I really am in the process of writing it up, Ed, but I think I'll burn it here. And that is, I think if she may have to reevaluate what he's doing, because he may realize that he could be embarrassed if he tried to take on Taiwan without a major revision in how he's going to do that, because not to get the details, but if you're talking about amphibious landing or parachuting, or your planes or your submarines and ships, look at what happened to the Russian Navy. It had to move its fleet out of the Black Sea. You know, the lead ship was destroyed, the submarine. You know, where are all the planes that you would think would be, you know, fighting in Ukraine? I mean, again, I think he has to think, and again, I don't mean to be a man of hope, because all of this is temporary. The world has great instability in it. But, you know, right now, I think if I were in Beijing, I'd be looking at the war plans and saying, let's take another look at it. And what options do we have to squeeze Taiwan that we can exert our will without a kinetic attack? So I wouldn't bet on it, but that's my sense of what I would like to think, how they're approaching it. Anything else, I think, is kind of foolish.
This brings me to the question of what the war of the future looks like. And let's use some of the points you've just made regarding Taiwan. What Americans tend to think of as the war of the future in that region is something like the Normandy invasion, and a huge amphibious invasion, whereby large numbers of PLA troops attack the island. And they certainly have a numerical superiority over the Taiwanese. The other alternative, and you've hinted at this, is that you don't look at it through that prism. You look at it through a prism of modern technology, where there is less exposure of individual troops and more of an effort to surround the island, choke the island off, utilize intelligence to undermine the capacity of the government there to govern, disable a lot of the infrastructure in the country through non-kinetic efforts, but utilizing new technology which can disrupt a lot of things on the island and make it non-functional or reduce its functionality. So what would you look at a war of the next, say, 5, 10, 15 years, and how would it?
When I was in charge of the program to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan, the Stinger went into the battlefield. I don't want to get hung up on this Stinger, but it's the one point where I could put my finger where I thought a weapon system changed history, right? So technology can change the course of warfighting, okay? At the same time that we did that, I was denied the use of drones because I actually had a staff that had produced the drone and we were going to load it with C4 and bring it into combat. And they said, oh, no, you can't do that. The lawyers. This is assassinations. Now, today, if you went around saying, wait, look at all the drone use. I mean, what happened? I'm just saying the world has changed radically on how we look at this between 85 and today. The Economist magazine years ago had the front page of the magazine, which I thought was brilliant. It looked like the movie The Birds of Hitchcock. It was nothing but drones in the sky, right? I think that was visionary about how the war is. So today there are videotapes online that the Ukrainians are putting out. And you get a firsthand look at how a drone follows a motorcycle and blows it up for 500. And the guy's running as fast as he can. A truck, tanks, people fighting in ditches, a guy having a cup of tea suddenly. But it is very brutal. The aspect of how deadly drones are at such low cost and how they can be manufactured and designed changes, and the vulnerability of ships and planes to modern technology. I think a Normandy scheme is, it could actually, I don't want to get too far ahead, but China's going to have a really hard time of doing a Normandy. So they're going to be cutting edge technologies they're going to bear. But the Taiwanese aren't any slouches in this area, and they're going to get a lot of help internationally. So I think it'll be that type of war. The other thing, and this is when I think of the poor troops on both sides in battle today, it's an unfair fight. In other words, John Wayne taking Iwo Jima. That isn't what we're looking at. You look at people that have no idea what's going to happen to them. They're blown away a second later by, mortar fire was never accurate. You had to get the GPS to eventually make it work effectively. So I think when you see this, I don't think most armies are going to have the stomach for this. So we're going to end up quicker than not. The speed at which drones are being improved is incredible. And guess who's at the cutting edge? The Ukrainians. But you're soon going to have combatants that are drone-like, because we won't be able, neither side, to deal with what drone war really looks like. So coming back to it, the more she is knowledgeable, and I suspect he's very knowledgeable on this, the less. And remember, his army has not been in a street fight since the 50s. So the U.S. Army, Ukrainian Army, you don't want to mess with them, because there's a lot of things you learn from the war fighting. So I think we need to be alarmed, and China, and it's also how it's growing in power economically around the world, influence around the world. We have a real struggle, okay, with China. The kinetic part is much more problematic than I thought it was before the Ukraine war started. And now I feel you can be big and powerful, but you better be careful when you even go into a small country to try and muscle, no matter who you are.
Well, thank you. That's really what I was trying to get at, and you've articulated very well that it's not, you can't use the playbook from Normandy to figure out what the war will look like over Taiwan, if there is to be one. It's going to be one that is dealing with the technology and based on the technology that we have today, and very substantial differences in strategy from 70 years ago. So thank you for that. I think that really gives a good sense of what the war of the future will look like. Let me ask one question, since we've got a lot of business people and financial people on the line, and that is, can you take a look at how economics and strategic issues interact today, in terms of how do you, and perhaps in certain circumstances, you undermine a country by undermining its economy, or you strengthen your ability to deter a country by strengthening your economic and your geopolitical alliances with other countries. But how do they, there clearly is an interaction. How do they interact, and how do we utilize economics to strengthen our position and respond to threats?
Well, I think the threat that we're facing, when you get down to the basics, look, we can look at the Civil War, and you can look at, well, how do you win a war? A lot of times it's logistics and the strength of your economy that produces the ability to wage war, right? So I think our economy is stronger than the Chinese economy by a long shot. I mean, they're closing in, but the health of the American economy, I'd rather bet on it. So I wouldn't worry too much about undermining the Chinese. I think our emphasis should be on making sure America is a strong, vibrant, and imaginative creative as it has historically been. And I think that's the road we're heading in. I wouldn't help the Chinese, right? I wouldn't help them get richer. And I think we might want to go back and revisit the way we invested in China, because it's come back to haunt us. But I think the best path, Bob, is a strong America. But I want to add something you didn't. That should go hand in hand with a united country on international issues, because the Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, they form, and Iranians form a real pact. And, we need to be united on international issues. As Senator Vandenberg said, foreign policy ends at the waterline. There is so much we have in common, but I think, we have to have a strong economy, a united economy that stops trying to peddle pablum out there and political sloganeering. And I think China may be the first place where I start to see that there's a pathway forward on this bipartisanship. But the economic part is key. I'll just give one more footnote. This as well as I do. This is going to be disheartening to people. Economics are very important in everyday business. But often when you get to the big policy decision, economic considerations are pushed to the side. And I had one of the major corporate investors in the United States say to me, look, the United States is not going to let Taiwan go because of the chips. They're so valuable, we can't do it. And I said, well, I'll just tell you how the meeting goes. It'll be about the geopolitical, and they'll say, we'll figure out how to deal with the chip problem later. So don't count on economic factors carrying it. I know everyone believes there's a conspiracy of oil and so on. So I think economics is it's the bulk of its strength. It's not necessarily gets into a single decision. So let me
Thank you. I see Barbara's face up there, and which means we're coming to the end. Before you go, let me just end on a light note. Your conversation with James Bond.
I think Barbara was asking me at one point about Hollywood, and I used to hate the idea of Hollywood because it trivialized the business. Right? And then I realized, wait a minute, the world thinks I'm James Bond, omnipotent, can do anything, serve the Queen, right? What are you doing? Stop going around saying that's not true. So I was in a restaurant with the head of a foreign country. Well, that country will go nameless, and we were with our wives. And Sean Connery walked into the room, and the whole room fluttered. Men, women, it was like the most exciting thing. I'm going to blame the other guy. I really don't believe I did this. I believe he did. He said, what are you laughing at, girls? We're the real thing. And of course, they broke out laughing. You're just two, in so many words, you're just two bureaucrats. So years later, I was down in the Bahamas, and it was a speech I was giving, and Sean Connery was in the audience. And then afterwards, he and I had dinner together. I told the story. He didn't laugh. He didn't think it was as funny as I did. So we sat beside him. I thought, well, I'm going to try and soften this up and say, I really like your movies, and what was your favorite one? And the fact that you served the Queen, that was the mistake. He said, wait a minute, I'm a monarchist. I mean, I'm an anti-monarchist. I'm a Scotsman. I thought, oh God, where are we going, James? So, but we went on to have a good laugh. But Sean Connery is, it's a great figure. Who doesn't like it? But that's not how spying's done, right? It isn't done. It's done more, as you said, things that aren't seen, quiet, but I'm not going to defame any any actor, James Bourne, right? You look at it and say, oh, this stuff is impossible, but is it fun to watch? So I watched James Bourne and I looked at the technology. We had it, but it wasn't integrated.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your time. That was just
Sympathetic to the for spy movies and even to the professionals. We should lighten up.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Bob. That was just a great conversation. And I just want to remind our members and their guests that we have one more event coming, which is next week, a conversation with the CEO of Zoetis, the animal care giant, and the CEO there, Kristen Pack. And she'll be interviewed by a fellow club member. Actually, they're both members, Alan Murray. And that'll be on December the 4th. And then we do have our holiday event coming up as well, which is complimentary for members on December the 10th. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. And as always, we like to thank the members of the Centennial Society that joined us today, as their financial contributions continue to provide the financial backbone of support for the work that we do at the Economic Club of New York. So again, thank you, Jack. Thank you, Bob. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Thank you. Same to you. And thanks, Jack, for a great interview.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Hopefully substantive enough.
Absolutely.
Very, lots to think about.